I have been called many things over 26 years in the surplus trade: methodical, thorough, mildly terrifying to estate families who expected their grandmother's china to be handled with more ceremony than a field inventory. A few of the less charitable assessments, usually from people standing over a table covered in adhesive labels and numbered boxes, involve words I won't repeat here. The Veldara priests called me something that translated, roughly, as the creature who doesn't understand what things are. They weren't wrong. That was, in a sense, the whole problem. My name is Ray Callard, 54 years old as of last March, 26 years with Compact Cultural Property Services, the last 19 as a senior cataloging liaison. Before that, 12 years in military surplus with the Terran Logistics Reserve, which is where I learned that the fastest way to sort a room full of miscellaneous equipment is to pick a system, apply it without deviation, and not ask too many questions about the provenance of things unless someone is actively bleeding. The system doesn't care if it's a spare engine part or a regimental battle standard. Neither do I, particularly. The label goes on. The box gets numbered. The sheet gets filled in. That's the work. The Compact Cultural Property Services posting to the Veldara Sacred Archive came through my supervisor, Diane Tremblay, who sent me the assignment brief with a short note. "You're the only one who would be calm about this." I took that as a compliment. I still do, though I understand now it was also a warning she didn't know how to phrase. The Veldara Sacred Archive sits on a station in high orbit above Veldara Prime, which is itself a planet of considerable religious significance to the Veldara people, who are tall, narrow through the shoulders, and covered in overlapping plates of smooth pale keratin that shift from cream to deep amber, depending on what kind of mood they're in. Their priests wear ceremonial robes with long trailing extensions at the shoulders that they use, consciously or not, to signal irritation, lifted slightly at the back, like the hackles on a dog, but quieter. I noticed this about 3 hours into my first day, because it was happening a lot, and it seemed useful to understand what it meant. The archive had been accumulating for approximately 1100 years. At some point around the 4th-century mark, the cataloging system in use at the time had been discontinued, and the replacement system had never quite been implemented. And so roughly a third of the archive's holdings were documented in a format that no existing translation matrix handled cleanly. Another third were documented in a format that the translation matrix handled, but that used classification categories the current priesthood considered obsolete and mildly offensive. And the final third had been moved into the subvaults at various points over the preceding centuries without documentation of any kind, because moving things seemed, at each respective moment of moving, more pressing than writing down what was being moved. My brief was to bring the whole collection into compliance with Compact Cultural Property Standards, which meant a consistent classification system, a complete item record for every object, photographs, weight and dimension notation, condition assessment, and a chain of custody log going forward. Standard work. I'd done it in a retired naval depot in Manitoba, a Pelari ceremonial storage facility on Veth Station, and twice for Terran University collections that had let their basement go for longer than was advisable. The specific religious significance of the holdings was noted in the brief, along with a standard advisory that I should exercise appropriate sensitivity. I brought my own labels. Standard Compact Cultural Property adhesive labels, acid-free, archival grade, the same ones I use for every posting. They're made to go on things. That's the whole point of them. I also brought my own scale, a Mettler-Haas digital, accurate to 2 decimal places, which I've had for 14 years and trust more than any equipment I've ever been issued. A clipboard, 400 numbered boxes in 3 sizes, flat-packed for transport. A camera, a reference binder, and a travel mug which is not, strictly speaking, part of the cataloging system but which has been part of every posting I've done since 2019 and which I see no reason to stop now. The presiding archival priest, A senior Veldara named Velthasari met me at the station dock. She was cream-colored across the shoulders and jaw, which I later understood was her baseline neutral, with a faint amber warming at the edges of the keratin plates nearest her temples. She looked at my equipment cases and said something to her assistant that the translation matrix rendered as, "Compact sends us a creature with boxes." I said, "Good morning. I'm Ray Callard, Compact Cultural Property Services. Thank you for having me." Velthasari said, "Yes." Then she walked me through the station to the archive entrance, which was a set of doors that were 14 feet tall and covered in carved relief work that had taken, according to the Compact background file, approximately 60 years to complete. They were impressive doors. I noted them on my clipboard under Entry Infrastructure and followed her inside. The main archive hall was large, roughly the square footage of a modest aircraft hangar, and lit by panels in the ceiling that emitted a blue-white light with a faintly warm undertone. The holdings were displayed on long, low tables and in open-fronted cases along the walls, with certain larger pieces on freestanding plinths. Everything was arranged with evident care and considerable aesthetic attention. The pieces on the plinths had pools of directed light falling on them from above. A few had small written placards in Veldara script. I set my cases down, opened the one with the labels, and started with the nearest table. A carved stone vessel, roughly the size of a soup tureen, decorated with a pattern of interlocking geometric forms, and said something that came through the matrix as, "What is the creature doing?" "Cataloging," I said. I was already writing on my clipboard. Item 1. Stone vessel, carved, geometric decoration, approximate dimensions. I measured it. 31 centimeters height, 22 centimeters at widest point. I weighed it. 4.6 kilograms. Condition: good, minor surface wear consistent with age and handling. Presumed ceremonial purpose pending further context. There was a pause. "The vessel of Veloran," Velthasari said, "has rested in this place for 700 years. It is among the oldest objects in our keeping." 700 years, I said, and added that to the condition notes. "That's consistent with the surface wear pattern. I'll log the provenance." I put a label on the base. "Thank you." Velthasari's shoulder extensions lifted, very slightly at the back. By the end of the first day, I had cataloged 63 items in the main hall. By the end of the third day, I had finished the main hall entirely and moved into the first of the side chambers, which housed the textile holdings. 3 of Velthasari's junior priests had taken to following me at a distance of about 4 feet, watching me work with the expressions of people who can't decide whether they're witnessing something deeply offensive or something so absurd it has looped back around to entertaining. I didn't mind being watched. People watch me work sometimes. It's a fairly quiet process. Label, measure, weigh, photograph, note, repeat. There's a rhythm to it that some people find calming and others find baffling, and in my experience the two responses are about evenly distributed regardless of species. On the fourth day, one of the junior priests, a young one, cream-colored all over with the amber only beginning to come in at the edges, which I understood to indicate relative youth in Veldara physical development, asked me, through the matrix, why I put the same kind of label on everything. "Because everything needs a label," I said. I was working on a ceremonial textile at the time, a long length of fabric in deep violet with silver thread forming what appeared to be a star map. The label is how I know what I have and where it is. If I use different labels for different things, I introduce a hierarchy into the system that may or may not reflect the actual relative importance of the items, which is a judgment call I'm not qualified to make. The system doesn't make judgment calls. It just counts. The young priest considered this for a moment. "You consider the mantle of Velsorath equivalent to a storage crate." I glanced at my clipboard. The storage crate in question, a wooden case, clearly a transport container for something and not itself ceremonially significant, was item 84, logged 2 tables back. I consider the mantle of Velsorath to be item 97, I said, and the storage crate to be item 84. They're both in the record. The record doesn't rank them. That's not what a record is for. The young priest went back to watching. The shoulder extensions were up. On the 6th day, Velthasari brought 2 additional senior priests to observe my work. I was in the secondary textile chamber about halfway through, and she said something to them that the matrix gave me as, "This is the method, the same adhesive tab, on everything." There was a quality to her delivery that suggested she was illustrating a point about the universe and its tendency toward disappointment. The 2 senior priests looked at my boxes and at my labels and at my clipboard, and one of them said something that came through as, "Where does the creature think it is? A market stall." I was measuring a textile at the time. 44 centimeters width, I said to my clipboard. Then to the priests, "I'm sorry I didn't catch that. Did you have a question about the process?" "No," Velthasari said. "We were simply observing." "Of course," I finished the measurement. "Let me know if there's anything you'd like me to explain about the cataloging method. The compact standards document is in the binder on the side table, if that's helpful." Velthasari looked at the binder. "There is a document," she said. "There's always a document," I said. "Page 47 has the label legend." I could hear them talking behind me, in Veldara, low enough that the matrix picked up the tone, but not all the content. What it did catch included something that translated as market stall methods again, and something that I think was, "The creature believes the mantle of Velsorath needs a price tag," and a third comment from one of the visiting seniors that came through as, "How does the compact produce these people?" I kept measuring. There is a thing that happens in this work, somewhere around the 2nd week of a large-scale catalog, where the novelty wears off and you settle into pure process. The room stops being a collection of extraordinary or significant or baffling objects and becomes a series of measurements and descriptions. This sounds like a disadvantage. In my experience, it is the opposite. Process doesn't get tired. Process doesn't decide that the next thing is probably similar enough to the last thing that it doesn't need quite as much attention. Process just does the next item. The main hall, 2 side chambers, and the textile vault took me 11 working days. On the 12th day, I started on the sub-vaults. The sub-vaults were accessed through a narrow corridor at the back of the main hall, behind the largest of the display plinths, through a door that was significantly less grand than the 14-foot entrance doors, but which was secured with 3 different locking mechanisms, all of which Velthasari had to operate with some ceremony before she opened it for me. Inside, a staircase went down 1 level to a series of interconnected storage rooms, lower ceiling than the main archive, lit by the same blue-white panels. The air was slightly cooler. "The sub-vaults contain overflow holdings and items in current assessment," Velthasari said. "They are not on public display. Some have been in these rooms for considerable time." "How considerable?" I asked. "Some for decades. Some for considerably longer." "That's fine," I said, and opened my first flat-pack box. "I'll work through them systematically." Velthasari watched me pack the first item, a small bronze-colored figurine, about 8 centimeters tall, that had been sitting on a shelf near the door, into a numbered box with tissue paper and an adhesive label on the lid, and her shoulder extensions went to an angle I hadn't seen before, which was not the irritation lift I'd become accustomed to, but something more lateral, which I couldn't quite read. She said, "That figurine has been in this place for 240 years. "I'll note the provenance," I said. "It is not a surplus item," she said. "No," I agreed. "It's item 428. The boxes are just for transport and condition management. Everything goes back after documentation." She looked at my boxes for a moment. "The compact," she said, to no one in particular, "sent us a creature with a scale." I finished the first sub-vault room in 2 days. It was mostly smaller objects, votives, offering vessels, personal items of unclear significance, and 2 textile rolls that had been stored incorrectly and were showing some humidity damage at the ends, which I flagged in the condition notes and mentioned to Velthasari, who seemed mildly surprised I'd noticed. The storage environment for textiles should be about 45% relative humidity, I said. These have been sitting somewhere higher than that. Probably fine for a while yet, but worth addressing. You noted this, Velthasari said. It's in the condition field, item 509 and 510. I handed her the relevant sheets from my clipboard. I can send the compact's textile conservation recommendations as well, if that's useful. There was a pause. Yes, she said, that would be appropriate. One of the junior priests behind her said something quiet that the matrix rendered as, "It noticed the humidity." I should say something here about what the subvaults felt like to work in, because it's relevant context for what came later. In my years working around collections, 12 in military surplus, 26 with the compact, I have been in a lot of storage spaces. The university basement in Reykjavik had a pipe that dripped into a bucket that someone had stopped emptying at some point around 2031, and no one had noticed because no one was going down there. The Pelari ceremonial storage on Veth Station had an atmosphere regulation system that had been set to the Pelari preference, and was running about 12 degrees warmer than anything I wanted to work in for 8 hours a day. The Manitoba Naval Depot had rats, which is a whole separate category of documentation challenge. The Veldara subvaults were none of those things. They were clean, dry where they needed to be dry, barring the textile issue, and maintained to a standard that was, by surplus depot metrics, exceptional. What they had instead was a quality of accumulated weight that I'd only encountered in a few places. The kind of weight that comes from a very large number of significant things being kept in one place for a very long time, layer by layer, each generation's holdings settling over the previous ones like geological strata. I don't find this quality oppressive. Some people do. I find it clarifying. When every item in a room has been significant to someone for a long time, the work of treating each one with the same attention starts to feel like the right work to be doing. The system is the right tool for the room. You measure, you record, you move on, you do the next one. That's what I was doing in the second sub-vault room, the systematic work. And that's the only reason I got to the far corner at all. I moved to the second sub-vault room on the third day. This one was larger, with deeper shelving and a higher ceiling, and it was clear that it had been used as something of a catch-all for items that didn't fit cleanly anywhere else. There were pieces in here that hadn't been touched in a long time, dust on the surfaces, some minor condition issues, items stacked in ways that suggested expediency rather than care. A few things had been placed in the far corner of the room in what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement. A cloth draped over several items, a low platform beneath them, a positioning that was too considered to be random, but too removed from the main shelving to be active display. I worked the room in order, left to right, front to back. Standard practice. You don't skip corners because corners feel like they might be different. Corners are part of the room. I finished the main shelving by early afternoon on the fourth day in that room. A young priest, different from the earlier one, this one with amber fully established at the temple plates and a more considered way of watching, had been sitting in the doorway most of the day, apparently with no particular task, apparently just watching me work. I had, by this point, become accustomed to being watched. I found it slightly easier than being alone, if anything, because the watching kept me from narrating my measurements aloud, which is a habit I developed in the Manitoba Depot and which tends to unsettle people. In the late afternoon, I moved to the far corner. The cloth was a deep red, heavier than it looked. I lifted it carefully, folded it along existing creases since it was clearly old fabric and folding it incorrectly would stress the weave, and set it aside. Underneath were 5 items on the low platform. 3 were vessels of various sizes, clearly votive, with the same geometric patterning I'd been seeing throughout the collection. One was a flat disc of what appeared to be stone, incised with text. The fifth item was a sword. It was a long blade, roughly 90 centimeters, from what I could see without picking it up, set in a plain crossguard of some dark metal, the grip wrapped in a material that had the look of aged leather but a texture I didn't immediately recognize. The blade itself was a pale color, something between bone and very light gray, and it had a quality to its surface that I couldn't initially place, not quite reflective, not quite matte. Something in between that made it look slightly out of phase with the light in the room. There was no rust, no visible edge wear, no surface pitting. It had been sitting here for however long it had been sitting here, and it looked, to my eyes, like a very well-preserved weapon in good condition, with possibly some unusual material composition worth noting. I looked at my clipboard. I was on item 647. I measured the vessels. Item 647, 648, 649. I measured the stone disc. Item 650, noting the incised text for specialist translation later. Then I reached for the sword to measure it and get a weight reading. "Stop!" The voice came from behind me, sharper than anything I'd heard from the Veldara since I arrived. I turned around. The young priest in the doorway was on his feet. His shoulder extensions were fully elevated, not the subtle irritation lift I'd been seeing for 2 weeks, but all the way up, the way I'd seen one senior priest go when she'd walked in and found me labeling the contents of the main case. "I'm sorry," I said. "Do not touch that," he said. His color had gone to deep amber, moving toward something richer and darker at the edges. "That object, do not touch it." I set the measuring tape down. "Can you tell me what it is?" He said something in Veldara that the Matrix paused on before giving me. "The blade of Velsorath." I wrote that on my clipboard. "And there's a reason I shouldn't catalog it." "There is a reason," he said, "that you cannot lift it." He left the room at a pace that was not quite running, but was clearly the gait of someone who had somewhere urgent to be. I picked up my measuring tape and started on the stone disc in the meantime. You don't stop working because someone has an urgent errand. Item 650, incised disc, 31 centimeters diameter, weight to follow. Velthasari arrived 11 minutes later. Behind her came both of the senior priests who had visited on the 6th day, and behind them 3 more I hadn't seen before, all in ceremonial robes with the shoulder extensions in a state of high agitation. Velthasari herself was the darkest amber I had seen on a Veldara since arriving. She came to stand beside me at the platform and looked at the sword, and then at my clipboard and then at me. "You were going to catalog that," she said. "Yes," I said. "I'm on item 651. "That," she said, with a precision I recognized as someone choosing their words very carefully, "is the blade of Velsorath. It has been in this place for 812 years. It was placed here by the 3rd conclave of Velsorath following the end of the 12-year silence. It has not been touched by any hand since the 3rd conclave placed it here." 800 years, I said. I noted it. That explains the excellent condition. The storage environment in this corner is actually slightly better than the main shelving, less air movement. Velthasari looked at me with an expression I had come to understand, over 2 weeks, as the Veldara equivalent of someone running a very long calculation in their head and not yet having a result. "There is," she said slowly, "a prophecy." I waited. "The blade of Velsorath," she said, "may only be lifted by one of divine bloodline. The 3rd conclave placed it here as a covenant with Velsorath the Undying, a vessel waiting for the hand worthy to receive it. In 812 years, every Veldara of sufficiently sacred lineage who has attempted to lift it has been unable to do so." I looked at the sword, then at my clipboard. "And you were concerned that I might disturb it," I said. "I was concerned," she said carefully, that you might attempt to lift it, find that you cannot, and experience some difficulty. I see, I said. Well, I'll note the ritual significance in the record, and if there's a weight restriction on handling, I can note that too and work around it. I can get good dimension estimates from the measurements without. The restriction, said the tallest of the senior priests, from the doorway, in a tone that was very carefully level, is not a matter of protocol. The blade of Velsorath is an artifact of divine covenant. It cannot be lifted by those without the bloodline of. I understand, I said. I'll flag it in the record. If the compact standards require a weight notation and I can't get one by lifting it, I can estimate from volume and presumed material density, or flag it as weight pending specialist consultation. I looked at the sword again. Actually, can I ask, was this in an unusual position when the conclave placed it? The weight distribution looks off to me from the outside, like the center of mass might be forward of where you'd expect on a blade this length. If there's an unusual material composition in the guard or pommel, that would affect the estimate. There was a silence in the room. You noticed, Velthasari said, the weight distribution. From looking at it, I said. The guard looks heavier than standard for a blade this size, and the pommel looks lighter than I'd expect to balance it. Makes me think there's something in the guard that accounts for the balance point. It's unusual, worth noting in the record. One of the senior priests said something in Veldara. The matrix gave me, the creature is talking about the weight. I'm just noting what I observe, I said. Do you know the material composition of the guard? Any specialist documentation would be helpful. There is no specialist documentation, Velthasari said. There are 800 years of sacred texts, and 43 separate scholarly commentaries, and one complete theological framework, and a prophecy in the second canon of Velsorath that describes the blade in terms of its divine nature and the bloodline required to receive it. That is the documentation that exists. I'll cite those in the record, I said. I wrote a note. Can you provide the titles? I'll log them in the reference field. Another silence. Ray Callard, Velthasari said, and I noticed she used my name, which she had not done before. Do you understand what you are standing beside? Item 651, I said. Sword, pale blade material, dark metal crossguard, aged grip material, approximately 90 centimeters overall length, unusual weight distribution suggesting forward heavy crossguard. Ritual significance, blade of Velsorath, covenant artifact, 812 years in this location. Condition, excellent. I'd say near mint for the age. Actually, whatever this material is, it doesn't corrode. It doesn't corrode, repeated one of the senior priests, to the room very quietly, like a man testing whether words still mean things. So I'll flag it as handling restricted per ritual protocol, and get the dimension estimate visually, and note weight pending, with a reference to the theological documentation. I made the note. Unless there's a way to get a weight reading that's compatible with the handling restriction, I'm open to suggestions. Velthasari looked at the blade for a long moment. Then she said, the restriction on handling is not a matter of ritual protocol. It is a matter of divine covenant. The blade cannot be lifted by anyone not of the bloodline. It is not a rule. It is a fact of what the blade is. Right, I said. I'll note it as intrinsic restriction, divine covenant, Velsorath tradition, handling status, restricted, weight, not obtainable by standard methods. I wrote it down. Is there a canonical spelling for Velsorath? I want the record to match the theological documentation. One of the priests behind Velthasari said something that the matrix gave me as, it is asking about spelling. 2 LS in Velsorath, Velthasari said, with the exhausted patience of someone who has given up trying to locate the appropriate response to the current situation and has decided that answering the question is the only available action. No apostrophe in the middle. The apostrophe is after Vel. Got it, I said and wrote it correctly. Thank you. I finished the other items on the platform, items 647 through 650, with the complete notes, photographs, and dimension records. I wrote up the blade as item 651, with the visual dimension estimate, and the weight pending notation, and the full theological reference block as Velthasari dictated the titles to me, which took about 20 minutes, and which she did with the air of someone who has decided that the correct response to a situation without a correct response is to be as accurate as possible. I labeled the box I designated for the platform items, a larger box, the number 2 size, that I'd brought down specifically for the oversized holdings, with the item range and the standard warnings, added a handwritten note in large letters that said item 651 handling restricted Velsorath Covenant, do not lift without specialist clearance, and set it to the side. The high priest arrived the following morning. I was back in the main hall finishing some supplementary notes when Velthasari came to find me, which was unusual. She had, over the past 2 weeks, generally let me find her rather than the reverse. Her color was a deep, sustained amber that was clearly not going to resolve to cream anytime soon, and her shoulder extensions were at a precise midpoint I hadn't seen before, which I later understood indicated formality rather than agitation, a different kind of elevated. High Priest Velsorath Keth, she said, has arrived for the ceremonial inspection of the archive holdings. The inspection occurs on the 3rd cycle of the Veldara calendar and has not been interrupted in 400 years. Of course, I said. I set down my clipboard. Would you like me to pause work during the inspection? Velthasari looked at me. The High Priest is aware that a compact cataloging liaison is currently working in the archive. He wished to see the work in progress. Happy to show him the record, I said. The binder is on the side table. I'm up to item 706 at the moment. The High Priest was older than Velthasari. His keratin plating had a slightly roughened quality at the edges that I'd noticed in some of the senior priests, which seemed to be an age marker, and he was accompanied by 4 attendants and 2 additional priests I hadn't seen before. He came into the main hall and moved through it slowly, pausing at each of the display cases, touching the cloth of one of the ceremonial textiles, and saying, at intervals, things in Veldara that the Matrix gave me as words associated with acknowledgement, continuity, and the passage of what the Veldara counted as sacred time. When he reached me, he looked at my clipboard and then at the adhesive labels visible on the nearest items and then at my boxes, stacked along the near wall. This is the one, he said to Velthasari in a tone that suggested he had been briefed. Ray Callard, she said, Compact Cultural Property Services. Good morning, I said. Would you like a summary of the catalog progress? The High Priest considered me for a moment with the flat, steady attention of someone who has spent a very long time dealing with things that require patient assessment. I would like, he said, to see the sub-vaults. We went down together, the High Priest, his 4 attendants, Velthasari, 2 senior priests, and the young priest who had been in the doorway the previous day, who had clearly decided to stay close to whatever was about to happen. I carried my clipboard because I always carry my clipboard. In the second sub-vault room, the High Priest moved through the main shelving area first, acknowledging the items there with the same slow attention. Then he reached the far corner and stopped. My boxes were stacked along the near wall. Items 647 through 650 were in the box labeled with that range. The box for item 651 was beside them, with my handwritten handling warning on the lid. The blade was not in the box. The blade was still on the low platform, where I'd left it, because I had not lifted it, and I had noted in the record that lifting was restricted, and so I had not lifted it. The High Priest looked at the blade for a long time. Then he looked at the box beside it, the empty box, waiting with its label and its handling warning, and then at me. You catalogued it, he said. Item 651, I said. "I have the full record if you'd like to see it." Dimension estimates are visual given the handling restriction, but I can refine those if you're able to provide any specialist documentation on the material composition. The theological references are logged in the record field. The high priest picked up the box and looked at my handwritten warning on the lid. He read it, or, at least, the matrix was rendering it for him, I assumed. His attendants were very still. "You wrote," he said, "that it should not be lifted without specialist clearance." "Standard notation for items with handling restrictions," I said. "The covenant detail is in the item record. The note is just a field flag, so anyone handling the box knows to check the record before proceeding." "This box," the high priest said, looking at the empty box in his hands, "was to contain the blade of Velsorath." "Item 651, I confirmed. "It's standard practice to prepare the storage container before completing the record, so I had the box ready. I just hadn't transferred the item yet because of the handling restriction. I wanted to make sure I'd gotten the right clearance protocol logged before moving it." Velthasari said something in Veldara. "The matrix gave me," he prepared the box. The high priest set the box down and looked at the blade again and then at me. "Do you understand?" he said, with the careful exactness of someone who has been in this particular conversation since yesterday and is approaching it from a different angle now. "Why this object cannot be lifted?" "Divine covenant," I said. "Bloodline restriction. It's in the record. Item 651, handling notes." "In 812 years," the high priest said, "no Veldara without the bloodline of Velsorath has been able to lift that blade. 7 documented attempts by priests of high sacred standing. 4 by members of the Veldara ruling lineage. 2 by beings of other species who claimed contact with Velsorath tradition. All attempts failed." "That's a consistent pattern," I said. I was, purely from a professional instinct, wondering what failed meant in practical terms, whether the blade was fixed to the platform somehow, or whether there was some other mechanism at work. Was there any documentation of the failure mode? I'd like to know what "unable to lift" means for the record, whether it's a matter of the item being anchored or an environmental factor, or... "No one," the high priest said very quietly, "can lift the blade of Velsorath except one of divine bloodline." He paused. "No one." I looked at him, I looked at the blade, I looked at my clipboard. "Right," I said. "So for the weight notation, I've got it flagged as pending." I noted when I was first working the corner that the weight distribution looked unusual from the outside. I was thinking the guard might be heavier than standard. If I can't lift it to get a scale reading, I was going to try to estimate from material density, but I need the material composition for that. If you have any theological documentation on the material properties of the guard, even approximate. "The blade," the high priest said, "cannot be moved." "I understand the handling restriction," I said. "I'm just trying to complete the weight field." I looked at the blade. I thought about the weight distribution. I thought about my 14-year-old Metler-Haas scale sitting in my cases upstairs. I thought about item 651 with weight pending in the record. I've been doing this work for 26 years. The weight field is part of the record. The record doesn't have "weight pending" in it unless I've exhausted every available option. I set my clipboard on the platform edge, reached over and picked up the blade. It was about what I'd expected from the visual estimate, roughly 2 kilograms, maybe a fraction under, with the balance point noticeably forward because of the guard weight, just as I'd suspected. It was lighter than it looked, which happens sometimes with items that have unusual material composition. The grip settled into my hand in a way that suggested good craftsmanship. The geometry of it was right for the hand, intentional, not decorative. The blade itself was the temperature of the room, which is always worth noting because some materials run warm or cold. I held it for about 4 seconds, long enough to get a solid sense of the weight. not long enough to get a good read on the material composition of the blade itself, which was genuinely unusual. Not metal in the standard sense, not stone, something I'd have to flag for specialist analysis. I set it back down, picked up my clipboard and wrote, weight, approximately 1.9 kilograms. Balance point forward of center, consistent with heavier guard construction. Material composition of blade, unusual, not standard metal or stone, specialist analysis recommended. Grip, ergonomic, intentional design, good condition, aged leather or similar material. I looked up. The room was very quiet. The high priest was looking at me. His color had gone past the deep amber I'd seen on Velthasari and into something darker, almost bronze, that I hadn't seen on a Veldara before. His 4 attendants were very still. The young priest in the doorway had both hands pressed flat to the wall on either side of him, apparently for structural support. Velthasari was the color of weak tea. "You lifted it," one of the attendants said. "About 1.9 kilograms, I said. "I'll get a more precise reading if I can get my scale down here. Can someone carry the scale? It's in case 2, the gray one, second shelf." No one moved. I looked at the high priest. His expression was doing something complicated that the matrix was not helping me decode. He was looking at me, and at the blade, and at my clipboard with the expression of someone who has been given a fact that does not fit the framework in which they have lived their entire life, and who has not yet determined whether the framework or the fact is wrong. "Mr. Callard," he said after a long moment. "Ray," I said. "Ray," he stopped. He tried again. "This blade has not been lifted since the 3rd conclave placed it here, 812 years. Every Veldara of sacred lineage who attempted to lift it was unable to do so. It is the central covenant artifact of the Veldara faith." "I believe you," I said. "I got about 1.9 kilograms. I wrote it down, it's in the record." I paused. "The guard weight is definitely the variable. I'd be curious about the internal composition, if there's any historical documentation on the construction." "How," the high priest said very carefully, "did you do that?" "I reached over and picked it up," I said. "I put it back down after. I noted the weight and the balance point and the grip condition and the unusual blade material. I looked at my clipboard. Is there a pronunciation issue with Velsorath? I want to make sure the record citation is accurate." The young priest in the doorway had slid, very slowly, down the wall, and was sitting on the floor with the look of someone who has decided the floor is a reasonable place to be. The high priest sat down on the low platform. He sat there for a while, not a short while. He sat there long enough that I went back to writing up my supplementary notes for items 647 through 650, because there was no reason to stand still while he thought, and I had notes to finish. The room stayed quiet. The attendants stayed very still. The 2 senior priests were standing close together near the shelving, speaking very softly in Veldara, in tones the matrix didn't attempt to render clearly. I caught fragments, something about the 3rd conclave, something about the 2nd canon, something repeated 3 times that came through as the same hand. The young priest had made it to a seated position against the wall, and appeared to be conducting some kind of internal review of his assumptions about how the afternoon was going to go when he started it. I finished items 647 through 650. I went back to check that the labels on the storage boxes were correctly aligned, and the item range notation was legible. They were. I added a note to the 647-650 box about the unusual platform arrangement and the red cloth, flagging both as potentially significant contextual details worth including in any specialist report. I noted the platform itself as an unregistered architectural feature of the subvault. It had clearly been placed rather than built in, which meant it was either a very old addition or had been brought in specifically for the Covenant placement, and either way it was worth documenting. None of this was dramatic. It was notes, but notes are what the record is made of, and the record is what you have when everything else is uncertain. The high priest eventually looked up. He had been sitting with his hands flat on his knees and his gaze on the floor between his feet, and when he looked up his color had come down slightly from the deep bronze, not cream, not even the neutral amber I'd come to think of as Velthasori's baseline, but something settled, a tone I hadn't seen before on a Veldara. Something that, in a human face, might have looked like the expression of someone who has found the beginning of a long thought and is not yet sure where it ends. "Ray Callard," he said. "Yes." "In the 812 years since the Third Conclave placed the blade here," he said, 14 individuals attempted to lift it. All of them understood what they were attempting. All of them had prepared. All of them believed, based on their lineage or their standing or their faith, that they were the one the covenant described. "And none of them could lift it," I said. "None of them could lift it." He looked at the blade. "You picked it up to check the weight notation." "The weight field was incomplete," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been high priest for 31 years, he said. "Before me, there were 9 high priests across the 800 years of the covenant's keeping. Every one of them read the second canon passage. Every one of them understood the prophecy. Every one of them believed that when the blade was lifted, it would be by someone who had prepared, who had understood, who had come seeking." He paused. "Not by someone who was annoyed about the weight field." "I wasn't annoyed," I said on reflection. "I just like the record to be complete." "Yes," the high priest said. "I begin to understand that." After some time, Velthasori came to stand beside me. "Ray Callard," she said. "Yes." "May I ask where you obtained the blade?" I looked up. "I'm sorry." "The blade in the box," she said. "Item 651. The box was labeled. Where did you obtain it?" I looked at her. Then I looked at my clipboard. "I found it on the platform," I said. "In the subvault, under the red cloth. I catalogued it with items 647 through 650. "Yes," she said. "But before," she paused. "The prophecy of the second canon of Velsorath describes the one who receives the blade. Among the descriptions is one that translates in context as the one who comes from a place of accumulated things, who does not see rank in objects, who treats the sacred and the common with the same hand." She stopped. "There are 43 scholarly commentaries on this passage. The prevailing interpretation has been metaphorical." I looked at her. "I'm from surplus," I said. "Military surplus originally, and estate sales, and compact archive postings. Mostly I go to places where things have accumulated and no one's dealt with them yet." Velthasori was quiet for a moment. "A place of accumulated things," she said. "Manitoba originally," I said. "Then Veth Station. Then a university basement in Reykjavik. Then here." The high priest from the platform said something in Veldara that the Matrix gave me as, very softly, "a place of accumulated things." I looked at my clipboard. Item 651. Weight, approximately 1.9 kilograms. Handling status, restricted per covenant, pending review. "I'm going to need to update the handling status," I said. "If the compact standards require weight documentation and I've now obtained it, the weight pending notation should be resolved." I made the note. "I'll also add a cross-reference to the theological record, if you can provide the full canon citation." Velthasori looked at me for a long time. "You," she said, "are going to cross-reference the second canon of Velsorath in the weight field of item 651. "In the reference field," I said. "The weight field just gets the number." She was quiet for a moment longer. Then, very precisely, she gave me the full citation for the second canon of Velsorath, including the volume, section, and passage number, and the titles of 3 of the most significant scholarly commentaries that would be relevant to the handling status update. I wrote them down. "Thank you," I said. Is there a standardized compact transliteration for the canon title, or should I use the Veldara original? The young priest on the floor made a sound that might, in other circumstances, have been a laugh. By the end of the day, the high priest had called a conclave, the first emergency convening in 60 years, according to the assistant who told me this with an expression suggesting he was still processing what his afternoon had contained. 3 additional senior priests arrived by the evening, having been on station or nearby. A theological consultation that was scheduled for the following month was moved up. The young priest who had been sitting on the floor eventually stood up, which I considered a positive development. I finished the subvault records. That evening I was in my accommodation on the station, updating the master catalog document on my compact tissue tablet, when there was a knock at the door. It was the young priest, the one who had been in the doorway, the one who had summoned Velthasari, the one who had ended up on the floor. He stood there for a moment without speaking. "Can I help you?" I said. "I had a question," he said, "if I may." "Go ahead." He thought about how to phrase it. "The weight field," he said. "Was it really about the weight field?" "Yes," I said. He thought about that, just the weight field. "The record doesn't have incomplete fields if I can help it," I said. "I flagged it as pending. I don't like pending. If I can get the measurement, I get the measurement." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been studying the prophecy of the second canon for 4 years," he said. "I have 3 commentaries memorized. I have spent considerable time thinking about what kind of individual the passage describes, the divine conditions, the sacred preparation, the spiritual state required." He paused. "I did not think about the weight field." "Most people don't," I said. "The weight field is very practical." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "I see that now." He stood there a moment longer. "The high priest has asked me to convey that the conclave's initial review suggests the second canon passage is likely to be reinterpreted in light of today's events. He thought you should know." "Thank you," I said. "I appreciate the update. Let me know if the canonical citation changes. I want the item record to reflect the current scholarly consensus." The young priest stared at me for a moment, with the look of someone who is updating several things at once. "I will," he said. On the last day of my posting, Velthasari walked with me to the station dock while my equipment cases were loaded. The season, or whatever the orbital equivalent of season is, had shifted slightly since I arrived, and the light from Veldara Prime coming through the station's observation panels had a warmer quality than it had on my first day. "The compact will receive the complete record," I said. "I've flagged the humidity issue and the textile holdings as a priority. The handling status on item 651 is noted as pending theological review with the conclave reference number. I wasn't sure whether to mark it resolved or ongoing, given the circumstances." "Ongoing is accurate," Velthasari said. "The conclave is still in session. I'll note that in the transmittal." She was quiet for a moment. "Ray Callard," she said. "Yes." "When you reached down and picked up the blade, you were thinking about the weight field." "Mostly," I said. "And the balance point. I was fairly certain the guard was heavier than standard, and I wanted to confirm that." "Not about," she said carefully, "the prophecy." "I read the prophecy," I said. "You cited it in the record session. I've got the canon reference." I paused. I didn't think it applied to me particularly. I assumed it was describing a Veldara of the appropriate lineage who hadn't turned up yet. I just wanted to complete the weight field. Velthasari was quiet again. "The passage," she said, "that describes the one who receives the blade. The 43 scholarly commentaries have debated it for centuries. The debate has concerned bloodline, sacred standing, divine connection." "Right," I said. "Not a single commentary," she said, considered the possibility that the one who treats the sacred and the common with the same hand, described a method of work rather than a spiritual condition. I thought about that. Fair point, I said. The system doesn't rank things. That's not a spiritual condition. That's just how the system works. Velthasari looked at me with an expression that, after 6 weeks, I had come to recognize as the Veldara equivalent of something in the vicinity of exhausted, bewildered respect. Safe travel, she said. Thank you for the canon citation, I said. The record looks good. I think you'll find the humidity fix makes a real difference for the textiles. I picked up my cases, my clipboard, and my travel mug, and I went through the dock doors. I filed the Veldara posting report when I got back, the same week. Diane read it and sent me a message that said simply, "Of course you did." I took that as a compliment. I still do. Item 651, Blade of Velsorath. Weight, 1.89 kilograms. Condition, excellent. Reference, Second Canon of Velsorath Vol. IV Sec 12 Para. 3 Handling status. Pending theological review. Conclave reference VD 442. The weight field is complete. That's the job.